Hello! In this short episode, I'm looking at recent comments by Final Fantasy XVI producer Yoshi P that the Square team have been considering dropping the numerical designation from their future Final Fantasy games, citing that new generations of gamers may find this incomprehensible or not understand that they are self-contained titles, but also the impact it may have on the ongoing legacy and relevance of the MMO Final Fantasy XIV, which I'll get to shortly. Now, I have thoughts on this, and Yoshida's comments seem to strengthen my long-running suspicion that Square's marketing team, their leadership team, and their general approach to game design in recent years is conflicted by this attempt to appeal to everyone and everything all at once. Because on the one hand, you've got these legacy players who have been playing the games for 20, even 30 plus years, and the legacy of the games, broadly within that. And yet conversely, you've got the influx of new generations of player year on year who Square obviously want to pick up their flagship title, and yet are concerned that the numbers of the series, and this, we're in double digits now, it may deter them from playing them because they may think it's an ongoing chronology and story. And looking at it this way, I recall things like Final Fantasy XV's introduction caption that reads, "A game for Final Fantasy fans and newcomers alike," that flashes up as you start a game, because this isn't something I've ever seen before on a long-running game series, and it struck me as not only slightly odd, but actually symptomatic of Square's inner conflict between old and new, how to promote these Final Fantasy games to a new audience, as it seeks to modernise while retaining some semblance of its own legacy. And this new debate of whether the numbers on the instalments should remain is simply another symptom and an extension of that, I think. So, for my part, these days I may reasonably be considered an old school or an older school Final Fantasy fan, having picked up the series in 1997 with Final Fantasy VII for the first time. And as such, of course, I have a certain bias, a certain perception and nostalgia towards the games, so I do quite obviously like the numerical designations of them. But I will try and weigh my opinions and the potential pros and cons here by looking at the implications of the numbered titles versus the non-numbered titles. And first and foremost, it's fair to say that the numbers are getting pretty unwieldy these days. As I say, we're in double digits, and I often look to other long-running games such as Tekken, such as Dragon Quest, and wonder how they are going to keep on running and how they intend to run with the numbers as we increase into these larger digits. And indeed, if we turn to other continuities and other long-running game series, such as Assassin's Creed, and even the new Mortal Kombat game, we can see how they change this up a bit and how they have departed from numbers entirely in some cases. And I can see the case for that being slightly cleaner. And Assassin's Creed Odyssey, for example, it rolls off the tongue a little bit better than Assassin's Creed 11. But at the same time, I would suggest that Assassin's Creed can get away with this because although it began as a continuous continuity, a continuous story, and increasingly departed from that, it's become much more renowned for the epoch and the setting that the games take place in. So, for example, we have ancient Greece with Odyssey, or we have Viking Britain with Valhalla. And so we could argue that the numbers don't quite matter so much, and much like the Elder Scrolls games, which are numbered, but the title tends to take the setting as its primary feature. So, for example, Morrowind or Skyrim and stuff like that. I think Assassin's Creed can sort of get away with losing the numbers. However, by contrast, Final Fantasy, as not only a much older game series that has this numbered legacy and has done so for a very long time, but it's also a series that has only fleeting connections between each installment that really hold it together and make it a series at all. It is the umbrella of the stylized Roman numeral and the runic script of the numbered titles that form this legacy, this continuity, and I think most importantly, the expectation of what these games are, going back 30 plus years. And indeed, we talk about mainline Final Fantasy games versus other Final Fantasy games, and by and large, the expectations of a numbered entry is what that distinction is and what it hinges on. And for example, it's fine that Dissidia or Final Fantasy Tactics or World of Final Fantasy are radically different genres from one another because they aren't numerical mainline games. And it is very much the number that has these connotations and these expectations around character, story, mechanics, and so on that carries this legacy and this popularity of the brand. So yes, while the prospect of Final Fantasy XVII, Final Fantasy XX, Final Fantasy XXXVIII might seem very crazy and improbable, there is huge stock in the title and the number here, and there's a lot of heritage bound up with that I'm not sure you can maintain or faithfully replace if you were to get rid of the number there. Moving on to Yoshida's comment that new generations might get confused or think that this is a continuous title that they need to go back and play from number one. I can only speak from my own experience here, and I would be interested to know how others found this if they can recall it. But when I first picked up Final Fantasy VII, when I was about 8 or 9 years old, I didn't even question the fact that it was a number 7. I don't think I regarded it as sequential, and I thought it was just a title. And so Yoshida's comment perhaps insults the intelligence of younger generations, maybe, just a little bit. And indeed, compared to those halcyon days in 1997, where you had to go and buy a monthly gaming magazine to find out what a given series was or what the details of a new game were, it's much easier these days for gamers to find out more about a given title because information is online everywhere all at once these days. So I think it's impossible that there would be very much confusion here because not only could you promote it in the marketing that it's a standalone title, but also it's bound up with this legacy and you can find out about it online. Now, moving on to the final point that Yoshida made, and this is one that did irk me somewhat because I always thought it was a dumb idea anyway, but he voiced his concern about future gamers not wanting to try out the ongoing Final Fantasy XIV MMO because when we are up at Final Fantasy 18 or 19 or 20 or whatever, they might think that 14 is outdated and not worth it. And indeed, is he wrong, because not many people are talking about Final Fantasy XI anymore. And he further noted whether it should have perhaps been called Final Fantasy Online or something like that. Now, I want to stress that I'm not anti-MMO. I like Final Fantasy XIV. I like the Elder Scrolls Online and one or two others, insofar as I really play MMOs. But the decision to give the Final Fantasy MMO games numerical titles always felt like an ill-considered move, and for short-term gain from some marketing or promotional perspective, I think. Now, their tumultuous releases aside, it seems perhaps that the leadership team for Final Fantasy at Square felt that the reputation of numbered Final Fantasy games would boost the sales of these MMOs, even though they are stylistically, mechanically, and genre-wise removed from what the numbered Final Fantasy games tend to represent. And again, as I say, the expectations of them. And again, not being anti-MMO here, but what they could have done, quite successfully I think, is create a new umbrella called Final Fantasy whatever, that the MMOs sat within. You know, much like Elder Scrolls Online, which is still a top 10 MMO today, and indeed the Nova Chrysalis spin-offs and stuff they've got like that, these different mythologies. Ivalice, another fantastic example. But instead what they've done is what the equivalent of making Elder Scrolls 6 an MMO is, which is pull a very niche or comparatively niche subgenre of RPG into the realms of a flagship brand. And Yoshida, who is obviously quite protective of Final Fantasy XIV, is now, it seems, wondering whether demolishing the future broader legacy of the series by removing the numbers might keep future generations interested in the MMO. So, in all, I think while unwieldy double-digit numbers is what Final Fantasy is fast approaching, I do think that the Roman numerals represent something important about the games, historically, reputationally, and experientially. And to remove that risks losing the cohesion, the chronology, and the repute of the titles in one fell swoop. And indeed, I commented on this interview, Yoshida's interview on Twitter the other day, and fellow YouTubers, Birds of Play, replied to me, noting, quite correctly I think, how Final Fantasy XIII's Lightning Returns feels curiously detached from the preceding titles in the trilogy, owing to its lack of numerical designation. And I agree with that. I think if we were to start naming the titles wild Japanese-type monikers like Final Fantasy Resonance or Final Fantasy Everwind or whatever, I don't know, but they would lose this connection and this cohesion to one another, and by extension this heritage and this lineage that goes back to 1987. And so it begs the question that if they were to pursue that line of thinking, should they even carry on being called Final Fantasy games at all? So that's my thoughts as to that, and my kind of knee-jerk reaction, I suppose, to Yoshi P's interview, that I think was perhaps unwittingly, but certainly inflammatory for some of the fans within Final Fantasy. If you got this far, kudos to you, and thanks very much for listening. And if you enjoyed the episode, please consider sharing, subscribing, and please do drop a comment to let me know your thoughts on the prospect of losing Final Fantasy numbered titles.